So a couple of weeks ago, I built myself my new system, which you can see actually right there, using an i9-12900K. Now, a couple of you have asked me whether I'm actually seeing significant performance uplifts, specifically in gaming, compared to my old CPU, which was an i9-9900K. So today I prepared a short video comparing the gaming performance of my very old chips, so the i7-7700K versus the i9-9900K, and then finally against the Alder Lake CPU, the latest and greatest i9-12900K. So if you're also looking to upgrade to an Alder Lake system from either the previous or the second previous generation, then this video hopefully can provide you some guidance in terms of what sort of performance uplift you can expect when going from these old generations to the Alder Lake architecture. Now for this video I benchmarked 4 different games. So first of all, I benchmarked Call of Duty Warzone, which is quite GPU intensive. Then I also benchmarked Rainbow Six Siege, which is both CPU and GPU intensive. The third game that I benchmarked was CSGO, which is insanely CPU intensive. And then finally I also looked at the performance that I'm getting in Battlefield 2042. So with this small selection of games, I hope that I can provide sort of a baseline of what you can expect going from these different architectures to one another in terms of games that are maybe more CPU or GPU intensive. In terms of overclocks, I ran the i7-7700K at 4.8 GHz, the i9-9900K at 5 GHz, and finally the 12900K at 5 GHz for the performance cores and 3.8 GHz for the efficiency cores. Now, to make the comparison of these 3 different chips as fair as possible, I paired them with the same GPU, so the RTX 3070 by Gigabyte, and also with the same memory, so 64 gigs of 3600 MHz CL70 memory modules. Now, I also benchmarked all of the games on Windows 10 and also with the same 1440p display. So if having said that, let's jump right into the comparison of our 7th, 9th and 12th generation Intel chips. Beginning with Warzone, here is the performance difference of each of these 3 different chips that I tested for this video. Note that the blue lines, or the dark blue lines, represent the average FPS that I'm getting on my standard benchmark run, whereas the light blue bars are 41% lows. Now in terms of average FPS, it looks like each of these different generations of CPUs gives me a roughly 10 FPS boost in performance. So it's quite a nice generational leap in performance. However, note obviously we're comparing 7th, 9th and 12th generation CPUs here. So it's not a 1 generation leap, which is also why I waited a little bit to actually upgrade until the 12th generation has been released, rather than going straight from the i9-9900K, which is a 9th generation CPU, to the 10th generation best CPU, which essentially I wouldn't really see much of a performance lift. Next up is Rainbow Six Siege, and here I have a bit of a different performance panel because Rainbow Six Siege is basically the only game that I benchmarked that actually has a built-in benchmark and that provides some valuable sort of metrics in terms of their benchmark runs. But what you can see here is that basically from left to the right we go up from the 7th to the 9th to the 12th generation of CPUs, and very much in line of that we gain about 40 FPS from the first step up, and then once again about 20 FPS to the 12th generation CPU. Also quite interesting is how this game actually quite nicely scales with the number of threads available on the different CPUs. So the i7-7700K, which only has 8 threads, has a CPU load of 85%, whereas the i9-9900K, which has 16 threads, drops the CPU load to 57%. And then finally the Alder Lake system with its 24 threads with all the efficiency and performance cores actually drops CPU load significantly even more to only 30%. So clearly this kind of bump up in threads available does decrease CPU load quite significantly in Rainbow Six Siege. On the other hand, if we look at the GPU load, we can see that this actually increases quite significantly over the different generations. And considering that with the Alder Lake system I'm now hitting 92% of GPU load, I think that this is probably the point where the CPU doesn't really have much of a tangible influence on performance anymore. However, if I really wanted to get more performance, I'd had to upgrade to a higher end GPU. Now, a game where I wouldn't expect a better GPU to make much of a performance improvement is obviously Counter-Strike Global Offensive. On screen you can see the performance difference of the 3 different chips. Unfortunately for this I only have the averages, but nonetheless we can see that we get quite a nice and almost linear improvement in performance with our later and newer generation CPUs. In fact, I saw almost 100 FPS gain going from an i7-7700K up to the 12900KF. So essentially if you're playing CSGO, then upgrading to Alder Lake definitely is worth it. And last but probably least, we have Battlefield 2042. Now, BF 2042 has been plagued with low performance ever since its launch, and apparently the situation has not improved even now that the game has been out for more than half a year. As you can see, there is barely any difference in performance going from our 9th generation chip to the i9-12900KF. Now this is actually the lowest improvement in performance that we've seen across any of the games that I've tested here today, and even though there is a slightly and somewhat measurable improvement in performance going from the i7-7700K to the i9-9900K, if you are running BF 2042 primarily and you think that your game is not really running well because of your hardware, then think once again. This game simply isn't able to utilize any hardware on this planet to the fullest of its extent, and therefore your game will underperform no matter the hardware that you have in your system. So once again, it has been proven that Battlefield 2042 is simply not well optimized at all. And with that, I'd like to briefly summarize the results of today's video. Now, the largest improvements in performance that we saw when going from an i9-9900K to an i9-12900K was using Counter-Strike Global Offensive. Therein, I saw about a 50 FPS improvement in performance, which is roughly 15%, so quite significant actually. The second place would then go to Rainbow Six Siege, where I saw about a 20 FPS uplift in performance, roughly corresponding to 8%, I guess. Next we have Warzone with about 10 FPS uplift in performance, once again roughly 8%. And finally Battlefield 2042, which basically didn't see an uplift in performance whatsoever, only 3 FPS, so definitely the worst of the bunch. So to finally answer the question whether it was worth to upgrade from my 9th generation system to Alder Lake in terms of the gaming performance, I can say that yes, some games definitely have benefited quite significantly, such as Counter-Strike Global Offensive. However, since I mainly play Warzone, the improvement in performance really hasn't been worth the investment of upgrading to Alder Lake, in my opinion. However, you should know that I also do other things with this system than playing Warzone, such as video rendering, which has improved in performance quite a bit since I now have 24 threads rather than the 16 threads of the i9-9900K. But that would probably be the topic of another video if you guys are interested in sort of a rendering or creativity and productivity comparison of these 3 different chips, then definitely let me know in the comments down below. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope it was helpful and interesting. If you have any more questions, then don't hesitate to leave them in the comments down below. Like this video if you enjoyed this content, or dislike if you do not have a very nice and shiny Alder Lake system to play with. Check out this video if you want to see a build log of my latest system and also kind of my thought process of why I selected the specific parts that I did select. And finally, check out this video for the best PC settings in Call of Duty Warzone since the Pacific integration. But that is it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.